Good afternoon, Mr. Premier.
Good afternoon, Carly. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for sitting down with me.
No problem.
I'm really excited to talk about the budget with you, and I wanted to talk about where we are first. I chose Rock Island. I call it my Reed Street office.
Oh, really?
When I was 13 years old, I was in a play here. I was in Julius Caesar, and Ruth Thomas played Julius Caesar. And Ruth Thomas, as you probably know, started basically all of culture. She's the cultural doyen of Bermuda. And I couldn't think of a better place to bring you to chat a little bit about what's going on in Bermuda.
No problem. You know what's funny? I very rarely drink coffee.
That's okay.
This is funny. So everyone's like, oh, I'm going to run home for coffee. I'm like, well, I don't really drink coffee, but that's
They have
okay.
tea. They have all the stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the first question that I feel a little bit silly asking this. I know that we're on the path for a balanced budget next year, and that's very exciting. And I know that that has to do with the fact that we are bringing down our debt, and this year is the first year in 9 years. Is that correct, that we are paying
Yes,
off
so we
debt?
were paying some debt this year, absolutely.
But what I have no idea about is who we owe our debt to, and if there's any sort of geopolitical consequences to who we owe that money to.
All right. Well, I mean, that's a great question. And the question itself makes sense because in some countries, sovereign countries, of course, which Bermuda is not, in some sovereign countries, they, of course, will owe their debt to other countries. From the Bermuda context, it's different. I mean, the debt may even be owned by some of you or I, invested via our pension funds. But typically, when we raise our debt nowadays, before when there was not a huge amount of debt finance, et cetera, it will be short-term from banks. Longer-term bonds that we do are typically with international investors. So these will be large pension funds, large family offices, and those persons who may buy it. So the debt is listed on public exchanges. It is traded on a regular basis, so you can have an idea of, how well Bermuda's debt or economy is performing. But mainly our debt is owed, I would say, mainly to large investment houses, pension funds, who are investing money on behalf of other people. Yeah, so that's why I say some of our pension funds may be invested in those funds, which invest in lots of various, as they call them, sovereigns around the world. So that's where it is. And when you speak about, our deficits coming down this year, and of course, is paying off $50 million of debt this year, the first time we've been able to reduce our gross debt in some time. I think it's important to make sure I give context, because a lot of times people talk about the debt. And when we were elected in 2017, back then I served as Premier and Minister of Finance as well, and we unveiled our first budget in February. And I remember everyone was expecting us to raise the debt ceiling. Right? At that point in time, the net debt was about $2.4 billion. The debt ceiling was 2.5. Everyone had said, you're going to raise the debt ceiling, go ahead, and all that, that noise. And we did not raise the debt ceiling. We delivered a budget that was able to increase revenues by not putting tax increases on the wide variety of the population. And at the same point in time, we did that by eliminating a loophole. And that loophole was persons like you or I who derive most of our income. I don't know about your investment history. I'll just say for myself, who derive most of our income from the labor of which we give every day, are taxed on all of that. But there are persons who do not work, but just earn their money from their companies. And those persons who are working with those companies might pay themselves, $200,000, but may take out $2 million a year from the company, and that wasn't being taxed. So we closed that loophole, which is something that, stoked a little bit of ire for some persons who were used to, for 350 years, that was untaxable. But we thought that was unfair. So we were able to gain additional revenue at the beginning. We did not raise the debt ceiling until Morgan's Point, where we had to go and borrow money. And the next debt ceiling raise was only for the pandemic. Like all countries of the world had to raise debt in order to make sure they could keep their governments afloat and to make sure they can provide support to people and businesses. So that's the history. We have no intention of raising the debt ceiling. I think we are about $400 million in the debt ceiling right now. There's no intention to raise the debt ceiling. It's intention to balance the budget, and that will come from economic growth, of which we've seen and witnessed over the past few years. And that was the theme of the budget, continued economic growth.
That really helps to contextualize it. Thank you. No, I need you to forgive me because I put some stats in my phone.
Oh boy, you got stats now.
So you actually started touching on this, so I'm glad that you did because you set me right up to ask this question. There are some liabilities for the government that are underfunded, and one that is actually often talked about is social insurance or the contributory pension fund. So I read that people 45 and under shouldn't expect to receive a pension. And the last publicly released audited financials were in 2012. And they were incomplete. But there was a report in 2020, and in that report it said that the fund was going to decline until it was exhausted in 2044. So all of those statistics aside, I guess my real question is, for young people that probably are actually just struggling with the day-to-day cost of living and haven't started thinking about their futures that far along, what's the plan for them? Because we're still paying into the social insurance scheme.
Well, so those things are complex actuarial analysis. And for me, I remember when I first went to Ministry of Finance, the late FS Manders explained that to me. And what those actuarial analyses are if everyone stopped paying into the fund today, when would the fund run out? And we know not everyone is going to stop paying the fund because these are mandatory contributions. But the base of your question makes sense because the real do is, I'm a little bit older now, I'm now 44, turning 45 this year, and persons are like, I'm paying into this, will I ever get it? I have a very simple answer. The answer is yes, because it is vital and essential that our social insurance system continues to function, because social insurance systems around the world are paid for by persons who contribute to make sure that persons who are senior citizens have a basic standard of living. Now, there's a few things that are tied onto that. Before, there were not private pensions that were mandatory. Public officers, of course, had the public service superannuation scheme. Hotel employees had certain things, and a lot of those benefits were negotiated. Some private employers have private retirement schemes where they put money in addition to social insurance. Now, of course, all employers in the country since 1998 were required to do that particularly. Now, on a broader level, the question of social insurance reform and pension reform is important. And that is one of the things of which we have said that we were going to progress, and we are going to progress. There was a first round of that that was dealing with how that's going to look, what are the necessary changes that are needed to make that happen. But there was some incomplete work that was done. And when I say incomplete, I'm often criticized for it, but I am a firm believer in trying to adhere to the platform that is put towards the electorate of which you said that you were going to promise. And one of the things that we said we were going to do is to adjust social insurance contributions to a percentage of income, which is the case basically in every jurisdiction around the world. And the example I often give is that the cashier at Marketplace, who might be making $50,000 a year, is paying the exact same amount into social insurance as the owner, who might be making $500,000 a year. That is fundamentally unfair. And our system, we haven't changed it. So we inherited our system from like the UK, the US, Canada. All of those persons changed their pension systems in the 80s, the 70s, and we haven't gotten around to doing that yet. Now there's been pushback from certain quarters. And my view on this from certain quarters is that these are responsibilities and obligations that you pay in every other jurisdiction that you operate. Why is it a different circumstance here? So that's going to be the final part of the review. There's two parts to that. Number one, low wage earners will see more money that they're taking home. That's the first instance. The second thing is that will make the social insurance funds more sustainable over time. In addition to that, we are going to have to make the changes, such as increasing the age of eligibility for social insurance, because as people are living longer When social insurance was first implemented, life expectancy was below 65. Now, of course, life expectancy is in the 80s. And so we have to plan for that and plan for those type of future projections. So the short answer to the question is yes, it will be around. The actuarial analysis of which it's done on an underfunding basis basically assumes that if everyone stopped paying today, how much time will it take for you to run out of your benefits? And so from that perspective, that's the way we look at it. We must make sure that we increase the amount of money that's going into the pot. We have to make sure that we are judicious about how much money is being paid out of the pot. And so from that perspective, so it can sustain over the long term. But the only way that these things are sustainable is to have a continuously growing and vibrant economy. And that's why it's so important to make sure the economy can continue to grow, continue to attract investment, continue to create jobs. So there is that activity that can have people paying into the system so that those persons who are now retiring, getting older, can receive basic pension from the system. The final thing I'll say on that is, as the private pensions were put in place in 1998. They came into effect standard about 2003. And now we're about 20 years from that 2023. By the time we get another 20 years or 25, most persons who would have started working at that time would have had very large private pensions, whereas the persons who didn't do it all their time would have had smaller. So that's going to build up, and that will provide more support for retirees. So persons our age group who are retiring in the future will have more because they'll have their private pensions, their public service pensions, in addition to social insurance.
I think that it's a really important social justice issue as well, to ensure that there's equity there in what people pay.
Bermuda is one of the most unfair societies when it comes to our system of taxation. It's something that we've spoken about. It's something that we've made changes to address, such as the change in which I spoke to you about, where people are taking out these dividends and not paying any tax on that. Unfair. That money went towards health and education. At the same point, the recent tax changes that were included in this budget have reduced the burden of taxation for those persons at the lower scale. To think that everyone under $132,000 will pay less taxes this year than they did last year is something that we recognize. And if we look over the history, the median salary in Bermuda is around $66,000. If we compare to 5 years ago to now, from the budget into the budget that we inherited to the one that we just passed through, persons who are in that average bracket would have saved $5,000 in payroll tax over that time. Now, that is, maybe some people say it's not enough, but the fact is that's $5,000 more that people had in their pockets rather than it being in the government's pockets.
Yeah, fair enough. And you've just touched on healthcare, and I actually have a question on that. I saw that the funding for the hospitals went up, and I saw that MWI, I think, was 8%. So bear with me because I've got a multi-pronged question here. The Bermuda Police Service just recently said that they had trouble finding candidates because they couldn't find people that were either physically fit or mentally healthy enough to do the job, and I understand that they have a tough job to do. Simultaneously, MWI has said that they want to close their services and move them within the community within 10 years. With that sort of in mind, can you comment on the resources allocated to mental health services in Bermuda and if there's sort of planned future increases for that?
So let me talk about what we've done, and then I'll talk about the future. From the issue of mental health overall, there certainly has been increased funding for those services. In addition to that, the whole community-based model is something that in previous budgets, we funded with capital funds to build community homes inside the community for mental health treatment. And part of this is about destigmatizing mental health. So when BHB will speak about moving and closing down MWI, the plan itself is age. Yes, but moving it into the acute care wing or the campus over there in Paget. This is about making sure that we're no longer mentally looking at health from physical health and mental health. It's all health and wellness. And I think that's part of the destigmatization. Also, one of the things that we did last year in the budgets, well, not in the original budgets, but when we did a mid-year review, we assigned additional funds to mental health. because what is important is that as we're going through healthcare reform, there's a number of different surveys and studies which they're doing to define pathways and to identify where the gaps are inside of our particular system. And so we did put additional funding provision towards mental health. And I know that there's also additional mental health funding that is going on to adolescent mental health as well. So there is more funding in this budget for that. And I think that it's important when you look at the context of those plans. The reason why is not only because of the aging physical plant, but also a move which you see more widely to try not to separate and stigmatize mental health cases from, I guess, physical health cases.
That's really important. And I think that just as a broader social justice issue, again, you have personally spoken out about how passionate you are about health. And one of the performance measures in I'm not sure if it was the Department of Health or the Ministry of Health, it was the Department of Health, had a performance measure indicator that said, establish program management office for universal healthcare coverage, which made me so excited. And I know that this was talked about a bit, plans for universal healthcare before, but could you just share a bit about what universal healthcare could look like for Bermuda?
Bermuda's healthcare is, I would say, I don't want to call it a challenge. I would say that from a Bermuda perspective, a lot of things we've just continued doing them because that's just the way they've been done. And when you talk about social justice, you have to recognize the fundamental unfairness of some things that were in place. A perfect example of a change of which we made in 2018 is that private insurers under the Health Insurance Act of 1970 were not, I guess, mandated to cover people. We'll start there. And so what they could then do is they could keep all of the good risks for themselves, pass all of the bad risks to government, maintain their profits, and then taxpayers would have to pay for the bad risk. And one of those changes were that we made everyone in the same pool so that all the healthcare risks are shared accordingly. And that means that you don't just get to keep the good risk and pass the bad risk off to the government. That was the first step. We then went to healthcare finance reform, which after, some feedback and all the rest, we decided to pause that and say, we're not going to just deal with the financing, we're going to deal with financing and delivery. The following year, there was a pandemic. The Ministry of Health has been incredibly occupied. Now that that has concluded and all of their pandemic work is done, they are now fully then back to reforming our healthcare system. And that means that we have to have better technology. So we see, medical records and electronic medical records. That means work on prescription drugs. We've introduced the drug formulary that will cap the price of certain prescriptions. You've seen the increased health provision in certain spaces for senior citizens as well. And then the next step insofar as universal healthcare is a basic healthcare package that everyone in the country has access to. Now, that's something that is standard in many jurisdictions, but the challenge that we have in Bermuda is those jurisdictions where people say, why can't we have universal healthcare? I will just say, if we think that Bermudians are upset with their 7% tax rate, they would probably be upset with the doubling of a tax rate, which should be able to afford that. Because, when we talk about, certain countries that have a strong socialist position, when you talk about Scandinavian countries, even countries in Europe, we're talking about tax rates that are in excess of 40 or 50%, which is not what we have here. And so we have to make sure that we design it so that it works for us, it's affordable, but it provides access. It provides access to those people who do not have access, because the challenge is that people who do not get early intervention, early help, regular screenings, regular checkups will then find themselves in the emergency room when it is too late, where the care becomes really expensive because they're in acute care at the hospital. And so that's the view and plan for it. I think that you should certainly sit down and talk to the Minister of Health, because I think that, she did give a presentation to the members of the Progressive Labour Party Central Committee the other day, which enlightened persons because they were able to understand the journey. But at the core of it, it is a healthier society. And that means that you have to have mental health, not mental health, but just health access for persons when it is available. So we're building another clinic, that's in the budget. We're building a clinic at the West End to ensure that persons have direct service and can access things inside their communities. A lot of the money that was redirected from that new tax, as I said, that we put in place, has gone towards community health. We had a shortage of community healthcare nurses, the person that are going out, the person to deal with adolescents, all those things. So from that aspect, we are continuing, as I said, to develop that. And the Minister of Health has been working on it. That is her thing. And I'm sure that she would love to speak about that more.
Yeah, I'd love that. I think that healthcare is a human right, personally. So I think that that's amazing.
It is a human right for some, but the fact is that everything that is delivered must be paid for.
Absolutely.
And that's the challenge, because as difficult as things are, the one challenge also is that the government cannot be all things to all people. And that's a difficult concept to get for some persons, because like, I want it to be, I do this. There are persons who get more than others, but at the very level, there should be a basic level of access to care. And that is helpful because it actually reduces costs over time.
So I'm going to change topics slightly and move on. We have read quite extensively in the news and a lot of speculation, quite frankly, about the recent Auditor General's report on the travel authorization forms and whatnot. You commented to say that there were a number of factual errors and incorrect references. Would you be able to share what those are?
Absolutely. I mean, I spoke to them in the House of Assembly, and the thing is, there's a very delicate balance here. And the delicate balance is that the Auditor General plays a very important role inside of any system of government. The Auditor General reports directly to Parliament, and it is Parliament's job to have oversight over the executive, which is the cabinet. And so from that perspective, I don't want to interfere with that role. The challenge that I have in this situation is if Auditor General reports contain factual errors, then they are less likely to be relied on in the future, and that is never a place where we want to be. In my view, it seemed as though if the report itself was rushed to be tabled in the last sitting of Parliament, it probably could have waited until May. And if there were questions or comments, the Auditor General's office could have reached out for information. That much being said, on the specific issues, I don't remember the page numbers. I would have hoped that persons would have actually read the report and not just read the daily newspaper's coverage of it, which can oftentimes be skewed. But the first item is that inside of the paper, the Auditor General said that I had failed to declare a conflict, and the contract that I was referring to was a contract with another entity, and that is actually false. And so she said that she had copies of the cabinet minutes, which in itself is any financial deal goes to the Auditor General for their review. That's part of the oversight to Parliament. But during that conversation, as is printed in the Auditor General's report, I'd expressed my concern about the fact that, how people talk in Bermuda, that somehow I was getting money from the travel authorization. The fact is that Bermuda has some of the strongest anti-corruption legislation in the planet that is actually recognized. And the police, they will go into my accounts, they'll go into everyone's accounts. And so that the whole thought of that, it sounds good for people to say, but it is incredibly difficult to do in a Bermuda context. And so that was the challenge of which I was sharing with the cabinet. And I said the recommendation that had come from myself to the team over at Health was actually a free program called Calendly Online. And that was for the original booking, because where this all started from was the booking of appointments. We were in March, everyone wanted to get appointments, and there was a difficulty doing it. They had written to me and they said, do you have any suggestions? I put them in touch. I said, Dennis might have something, go ahead. I said, Dennis, do you think there's anything such as Calendly? This is all the things that I read on the record in Parliament. And so for her to say that I was referring to something else when that is not factually correct, and she was referring to a contract that I had signed when that contract wasn't even in place at the beginning of the pandemic, is just a factual inaccuracy that could have been really picked up at the very beginning. Then she went on to reference that a system that we were looking to develop to, for persons who have access to government services online, which I think is something that most of us would like.
Right, yes.
Had the exact same features of the travel authorization, which is just false. The travel authorization was built on top of the testing system because the time when they had done it was, you remember, people used to have 3-day tests, 7-day tests, and all the rest, and it was to tie everything in. we had tried other systems. And I think that's the thing that's lost on persons. When it came to the vaccination thing, we had tried other systems. The public, PAHO or the World Health Organization had something, but it was an actual disaster. People couldn't get their records right, couldn't get certain things. And so IT that works, and this is me coming from IT that works is not inexpensive. And so when we talk about the Auditor General's report, that's the challenge. But for me as Minister of Finance, for me as a Premier of the country, I have to be very careful about, speaking of that, because the Auditor General's reports are a fundamental part of our governance. And so though these are a special or public interest report, as her office called them, I think that it does a disservice when anything comes out that is not factually correct, and that information could have easily been corrected if they said that. But to make the jump from cabinet minutes, especially when if the Auditor General had wanted, would have happily sent her the email that I would have sent, which I was able to read in Parliament, would have shown that she was incorrect.
Thank you. And I want to say that a friend of mine was talking to me in advance of this because I tried to poll my friends about what to ask you for this, and they were speculating about me asking this question, and they said, if the Premier had $45 million in his bank account, I doubt he would be the Premier.
Your friend is 100% correct.
He would be on a yacht somewhere. So
let me tell you something, Carly. When that story came out, I was actually on my way to the UAE. Whenever I travel, I like traveling. The only reason I like traveling? Because I actually get to catch with my email. So there's no one to disturb me. So I pull up my laptop, connect to the Wi-Fi, and try to catch my email. And before Wi-Fi is universal, my ministers would know if I'm traveling because I wouldn't have it. And I have all my emails that are all land. People get multiple emails in their box just trying to catch up to things. But because I understand the sensitivities here, I wanted so bad to say something. And that was literally what I was going to say. I was like, if you all actually think that I have $48 million sitting off on the side, I can promise you I wouldn't do this job. But then I also want to say, does anyone want to be a millionaire? And I was actually trying to my trainer the other day. Does he want to be a millionaire? He's like, sure, how? I was like, 5 of my 48 million, you can have half. I can just state that. But do you know how ridiculous that was?
Yeah.
It was from this website this was interesting, that judged my social media value. Apparently, my social media value is that much. But that's
good for you. Somebody in your office needs a raise. Then that's not my last question. My last question: there is a lot of discussion about which schools will open and close, and you've talked about that already on other interviews in this series. So I'm not going to ask you that. What I'm curious about is in the budget. Is there allocation for the maintenance or repurposing of the other facilities? What's going to happen to those other buildings?
That's a great question. I don't know, to be honest. And I say I don't know, not because there isn't an overall plan, but that is something that lies within the Ministry of Public Works. So the way it works, of course, Works and Estates owns the buildings and Education uses those buildings. When those buildings are discontinued, they will go back into Public Works. There's some views for some buildings. There's already some plans and thoughts of what some of those matters may be converted to. And so there is planning that is going on, but right now we're going through, and it's really difficult. And when I talk about education reform generally, when we talk about long-term economic success, you need to have a strong education system. And the work of which we're doing to reform our public education system has been looked at globally and has been celebrated as, very advanced, because very ambitious. 25% of what we're doing has to deal with new buildings and new schools. Most of it is the curriculum, the learning, how our students learn, making sure that what we're doing is appropriate for the future. And I think that's the biggest challenge. With regards to the buildings, they will all be put to productive use. So you can look at Tatum, a perfect example. Tatum is a space where, it's a community space. There's gyms there, there's businesses there, there's churches there, there's other items which are serving the community and kind of going into that kind of community hub. And so from that aspect, there will be certain space and instances. And I think what will happen is when the final decisions are made in regards to school transition, as we're going through this consultation period right now, when the final decisions are made, I think it'll be up to the Minister of Public Works, who will probably also go out to consultation to find out what are the things that are needed insofar as in these communities. Because some of these schools and some of these buildings, some of these campuses represented, things that are certainly attached to persons over the long term. And so it's really a question of what they'll be used for as we go forward into the near term. But the Minister of Public Works would know that. So the I don't know isn't that the government doesn't know. It is that that's not in my responsibility. One of the things that I've learned to do better in the almost 6 years that I've been doing this job is to allow my ministers to do that and not to try to step over my ministers. There was a time when I would, have all the information, say all the information, all the rest, but now I'm trying to make sure I remain focused on my finance role, make sure I'm focused on advancing the broader government agenda and making sure that ministers speak to their specific responsibilities. So there will be a plan. I can't necessarily say because the decisions aren't finalized. When all those matters are finalized, then I'm sure the Minister of Public Works will come forward. But the one thing I'm going to say is I want people to be excited about new schools. And I'm so excited about what's going to happen at Francis Patton and Purvis. I'm excited about the signature learning programs which are happening right now, where we are always talked about, we need technical education and trades education. Well, that's what's taking place at Cedar Bridge, the business education, which is taking place at Berkeley. There are real changes that are happening. And I would hope that we focus as much on where the schooling takes place and in what building, new building it will take place, as much as we focus on what is actually taking place, the transformation that is taking place with learning. Final thing I'll say, shout out to all teachers. They are great. They've been through a lot. And yeah, they are great. I was speaking to a teacher earlier at Eid, earlier today when I went to the Eid celebration, and she was talking about her challenges. And I said, I hear you, because I know how much stress and pressure they're under. And the government, as I said, as we finish this consultation process, will then assess where we are and then be able to come back to the public.
Yeah, I think teachers are incredible. They're really, they're responsible for the development of our young people and the growth of our country beyond, respectfully, the politicians.
Yes, absolutely. It's okay, don't worry. I mean, we're just temporary trustees.
Yeah.
And we're fortunate to live in a imperfect democracy. I say an imperfect democracy because we're still in a space where the government can pass laws and someone 3,000 miles away can say, no, you can't have that. But we continue to work into advance.
And hopefully we continue to work at that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know where my heart is.
What a good note to end on. Thank you very much for meeting with me.
No problem, Carly. And I will say this. I want to thank you for your continued advocacy on social justice issues. But I just want to also thank you for your continued work on celebrating culture and always supporting Bermuda. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.